G'day, I'm Mick, this is a DM breakdown and it'll probably be a long one, so let's not mess about. Spoilers for Critical Role Season 2 Episode 26, Found and Lost. It's been nearly 2 years, so I think it's finally safe to talk about. If you've never been through one of these before, I'm going to walk you through the session start to finish from a DM's perspective, and at the end I'll highlight some of the more salient learning points, which you can skip to if you're not keen on the long haul. The theme for this episode, the big spoiler, is unintentional player death, and all the converging, contributing components you can keep an eye out for. But first, to quickly set the stage, behind the scenes, Laura and Travis had been expecting their first child, and Mercer was accordingly putting pieces in motion to create a fitting excuse for their characters to be absent for a few weeks or months as they get settled. Long enough for a proper story arc, and in this instance, Mercer was maneuvering a group of slavers to abduct the pair, giving the rest of the party a clear quest and many potential ins for guest stars to have similar motives and join in on the hunt. After all, slavers tend to make a lot of enemies. However, Baby Ronan came earlier than expected, and Mercer ended up having to personally puppet Travis and Laura's characters into the slavers' shackles. And because this coincidentally overlapped with Ashley's departure for a while, Mercer decided to bundle her absence within the same event. And so the previous session concluded with the trio chatting on watch, finding themselves silenced, struck down with hold person, dragged by manacles, and finally thrown into cages which were magically concealed on the backs of a few wagons. It's here, as the remaining players stirred awake, that Found and Lost began. Now, unlike some of the previous sessions we've covered, the recap here has very little import. The party just tied up a small story that holds no immediate relevance, no weight over the coming session, so the retelling here can be extemporaneous. There are no threads Mercer needs to restate, there are no misinterpretations he needs to correct. It's merely a prelude to warm up the players, to remind them of their characters' mindsets prior to this event. For while they know they're going to be spending the first act looking for the missing players, their characters are still blissfully unaware, their thoughts still lingering on what came before, something that's further reflected in the intro. Here Mercer isn't particularly forthcoming, he treats it as a standard camping and awakening event, something that can become repetitious, but he keeps it fresh by focusing on change, motion, and detail. The sun isn't up, it's creeping over the mountains. The grass isn't covered in dew, sunlight breaks through the ridge and glistens in the frosted dew-topped grass like tiny crystals. The sky isn't cloudy, it was clear, showing stars, and is now matted with clouds, small breaks allowing some blue to seep through. The players don't just wake up, what do they feel first in this environment? The cold, it shakes them awake and they rub their eyes, so what do they see? Exactly what they expect. All is normal, except for one thing. I'll quickly touch upon the timeline. Mercer usually aims for 3 to 4 hours with a break halfway through, and here we can safely expect to start with the players investigating to discover which way their missing friends were taken. Then we'll bring in the guest and have them all head off together. We'll have a travel encounter that can bring us to the break, and then after the break we can foreshadow the big bad secret and set the stage for the second guest who unfortunately couldn't make it this week. Then if need be, the players can have another travel encounter, but knowing these players, usually when there's a guest, a lot of time is spent with in-character crosstalk. So although there's plenty of room and half a dozen possible encounters waiting in the wings to drop in as required, they mightn't even get through one of them. This is likely to be a roleplay heavy day or two of travel with the characters getting to know each other and formulating a plan. So the players jump into character, immediately role-playing the discovery of their missing friends, and Mercer has to deal with a lot of perception and investigation rolls, most being really low ones. First up is Liam, who scans the area with a 9 perception. Mercer smiles to himself. This is the first roll of the game and it's too low to be helpful, so what can he say? Well, first he repaints the environment he just described, but through the eyes, through the lens of Liam's character. What does he notice? How does his perspective change the colouring of this scene? The morning mist is burning off. Tacking on the real answer to the question asked at the end, there's no sign. So you didn't find what you wanted, but this is what you do see, and how you're seeing it. Sam's turn, looking for notes, 8 investigation. This is more specific than scanning the area, so Mercer focuses on the action, describing it in 3 beats, escalating the detail each time, but ultimately to no avail. Taliesin checks for fresh tracks, investigation, 2. And rather than firing off a third response, Mercer holds off. In something like this where there's no pressing time crunch, logically, even with a low roll, the players will eventually find something. And if they keep declaring every little thing they're looking for, and Mercer keeps describing it in deep first-person detail, the session will start to bog down, grind to a halt, or worse, start feeling grindy, where the players accept they just need to keep rolling until they say the right thing and see the right number. So Mercer wants to combine a few of those actions into one description. And as Liam starts casting to turn his familiar into a bird and Mercer gets a natural 1, Mercer wraps these 3 into a combined acknowledgement of their actions, so they don't feel like they were ignored and the game maintains momentum. And with a natural 20 perception through the eyes of his bird, we start making progress. And it is through the eyes of the bird, but this slips Mercer's mind at first. He catches and corrects himself mid-sentence, and if any of the players noticed, it didn't bother them. We all make slips like this in the moment, and we see Mercer handles it by paying it no mind and simply continues painting the scene. Or rather, telling them where to go. It's been over 5 minutes and they've achieved nothing, so this is pretty direct. Head over there and I'll tell you more. And once there, we get the first real evidence for the player characters as to the threat posed by these new villains. Trenches have been dug, dirt piles mounded. That's a lot of effort for an ambush. 5 to 8 sets of footprints. At 4, that makes the players wildly outnumbered. Drag marks that lead back to the road and meet several heavy wagon wheel tracks. That's some proper preparation and forethought they're demonstrating. And the players have had a few run-ins with bandits and ambushes by this stage, so they have enough points of reference to know that this is on a level of organization and execution far beyond anything they've experienced or could reasonably have expected. Arriving at the road, Sam wants to figure out in which direction the wagon tracks lead, and upon first hearing that, even Mercer reacts as if to say, "What? How?" But instead of saying no, he allows a survival check and buys some time to think of a solution. Sam ends up rolling too low for a useful answer. That's the other benefit of asking for a check before responding, but how could we answer this helpfully? A wagon track may be just a line, but they have to be pulled by something. So describe the player having that brainwave and expanding their focus. Noticing the wagon wheels aren't the key, they can tell the direction from the mud torn up by the horse tracks. Or if the character is particularly wise, they figure out that the captives were loaded onto the wagon, so the tracks leaving should be deeper from the extra weight. Or the answer Mercer eventually gives away freely, that you can tell from the angle of the tracks as they pull sharply off the road and slowly back on. Now, why did he give it away for free? Well, this is one of those situations you sometimes find yourself in where the characters would be able to see the pieces and logically make the connection, but it's hard to communicate that to the players without either drawing all these details on paper or simply doing the math aloud for them, so to speak, as he does here. Similarly, you'll notice Mercer often uses the phrase, "what appears to be," "what seems to be." And that's the same thing. It's a tool to fast track his descriptions to what's important, what's different, what catches their attention and has meaning. The players start cross-talking in character, and Mercer says, "Why couldn't we hear anything?" Mercer shoots a glance at this. She's making a clear reference to the previous session where Mercer described the silence spell as part of the ambush. And it's plausible that the hyper-alert bow would be suspicious that nothing disturbed her sleep. The conversation moves on, but Mercer can now be assured that at least one player hasn't forgotten those meta details. And now with Sam checking for blood and finding very little, it's safe to say the players have a growing number of worrisome facts about these villains. As the conversation loses a bit of focus and Taliesin looks around again, Mercer uses this moment to bring in the guest player, Ashley. They've already seen everything there is to see, they're lacking direction, perfect timing. And the roleplay starts up again. But in the initial, confrontation, Taliesin shouts demandingly, "What are you doing in the bloody bushes by our campsite?" Which perks Mercer to attention because they're not near the campsite. She wasn't in the bushes. There aren't any bushes or trees for miles. She was just walking down the road and they all charged at her. That's quite a correction to have to make. But Mercer doesn't jump to interrupt to clarify his knowledge, he waits to see how Ashley handles it. And she does so brilliantly. They keep bouncing off each other and Taliesin's mistake is quickly forgotten, to the point that correcting it would no longer even be relevant. Once Ashley has been at the table for not even 10 minutes, she freely offers up that she knows who took their friends. You'll see Mercer rearranges his notes at this. It's common with guest players who have some inside knowledge to the quest at hand for the DM to keep a copy of those facts on paper at the table, both to remind and assist the player, but also so that they themselves don't make a mistake and give the player a truth that their character would realistically have misinterpreted. And in the ensuing quiz, as we approach 40 minutes in, the first faulty brick is laid in this foundation. Sam asks how many of these slavers, the Iron Shepherds, there are, and Ashley says 5. Sam glows at this. "Hey, we're 5. It doesn't matter that the number is later revealed to be false. An equal or lower number within 5th edition's combat mechanics tends to immediately inspire confidence in the players that a fight is mechanically not just possible, but plausible to win. And while easily planted, that seed's a lot harder to dig back up. But what's more worrisome for Mercer is that no one brings up the footsteps from the ambush site. So if that knowledge, that clue is already forgotten, every hint of their danger he gave back at the start of the session can be written off as well. Marisha, as the resident god of note-taking, does pull out some information from quests gone by. The name Ophelia Mardun. Has Ashley heard of it? And at this name, Mercer's eyes immediately dart to Ashley, ready to feed her a gentle nod, but she never looks over, answering no and continuing the conversation. And again, instead of interrupting to say, hey, Ashley, nah, you should have said yes, Mercer allows the roleplay to continue and waits for a lull, at which point he gives Ashley a hint that something about that name is familiar, giving her the opportunity to continue realistically in character as if she just clicked. Oh wait, no, there is something about that name, which is a great gentle way to correct the player without them feeling like you're playing for them or that they did something wrong. At 45 minutes in, Mercer explains the travel mechanics available to the players and what choices they have, in explicitly mechanical, gamey terms, which is, well, for 2 reasons. One, he knows the pace and timetable for the Iron Shepherd, so how the players handle this will determine how quickly they track them down and what interactions they're able to observe from afar. But also, 5th edition travel mechanics are rarely actually used, certainly not in Mercer's games or at higher levels. So it's almost a novelty factor of, hey, here's something different, let's try it out. It adds a little bit of strategy with talking to the Shepherds, and they're almost high enough level to bypass ground travel and never have this chance again, so why not? Mercer calls for the marching order, and having already done a fair amount of travel in previous sessions, he's started condensing this part of his routine, taking a single roll for the person on watch and using that to colour the description of the entire day's travel. And here we see that he's given himself a theme, a consistent note to bridge all the environments that are going to come up throughout this session. Mercer has decided to revolve his descriptions around a larger scale event, a coming change in the weather. Now, travel can often feel to the players as this linear sequence, a bit railroady, spiced up only by the occasional encounter along the way. So here Mercer throws a choice, a branch at the players. Do they venture into the crossroads or skirt around the forest in true mud fashion? Which, considering the players take almost 10 minutes deciding, you could consider this a cheeky little encounter of its own. But really, it's a nice thing for him to do because it gives the players a sense of agency. They feel that despite moving from A to B, they're still having input and using their judgment to direct their future, rather than just waiting for the next thing to pop up on the road. And deciding to skirt around the forest, they come to a ruined homestead. The players investigate, loot it, but rather than jumping straight into an encounter, Mercer holds off and keeps track of the time that the player characters spend inside. Now, it's entirely possible for the players to get in and out without drawing the attention of the Ankh, but when Liam decides to spend 10 minutes casting a spell, their fate is sealed and Mercer triggers the encounter. And although it's quite a quick bit of combat, only about half an hour long, you can see afterwards the players are a little quieter, a little slower, as often happens after the adrenaline and excitement of combat fades. And observing this, Mercer keeps them going only a little while longer so he can tease the next encounter before giving them a break to stretch and refresh. So he describes a fire nearby in the forest and allows the players on watch to discuss and assert an action. In this case, Liam sending his familiar in the form of an owl in to investigate. And right there, Mercer calls the break, which is a great time for me to mention these videos are made possible by my patrons. We return from the break and Mercer immediately continues his description, and what follows here is a delightful set piece of misdirection and foreshadowing rolled into one. Mercer is careful to paint this scene in a way that is technically accurate, but framed to deliver a message that he knows the players are going to misinterpret. And even his body language, his movement, changes to reflect their assumptions as the scene progresses. He starts with the most distant view as Liam's familiar approaches, drawing attention to the motion, steam rising off a bowl, the details, tattered clothing that drapes off her body, and what stands out, what's different from their expectations. She's tall, very tall, and hunched. Getting a little closer, Mercer does a second pass in higher detail over the scene. We get the skin and hair tone, the ear shape, and can make out a little more of the environmental details, and even touch upon the general actions of the child. From the skin and hair alone, Talison's eyes almost leave his body, Liam even saying in character that this reminds him of unsettling stories his mother spun when he was a child. They decide to continue watching from the same distance, so Mercer maintains the same level of detail and just continues describing the actions taking place, with the added touch of now colouring the scene with the concerns currently clouding Liam's mind. He emphasises the child's discomfort and the woman's long fingers and shoulders, and even clunkily describes a mass of liquid in the cup. Very suspicious phrasing, knowing full well how they will interpret all this. I'll temporarily say spoiler for the rest of Lorenzo's story so I can speak plainly. Mercer has led them quite strongly as very experienced players into thinking that this is a hag, a creature that steals and eats children. This is the first nudge, not even that, the first glimmer that the players have to start thinking more about Lorenzo's true nature. Although they have no reason to think upon it just yet, they are going to find out that he's been stealing children. So by planting the thought in their minds here, the concept of a creature that eats children, it's reasonable that the players will eventually think to circle back around when they're hearing more stories about Lorenzo. He's stealing children. What if he eats them? What if he's a hag? What are you talking about? He couldn't be a hag. Well, alright, not a hag, but something else that eats children. Whoa. Do I know of anything else that eats children and looks human? Okay, as I was saying, it's a really delightful, subtle move that either pays off or the players look back on and slap themselves for not realising. Spoiler over. After they've cleared the air with the Furbolg, Mercer uses her to remind the players of the power of the Iron Shepherds. Her tribe, a group of 20, were wiped out by arrowfire, nets, and silence spells. Mercer making a show of turning to Ashley in front of the other players and highlighting the fact that you are familiar with these methods. A prompt for her and the table to say that there is more information here to be shared and better inform your understanding. He also reveals that the Iron Shepherds are taking both the strong adults and children, a key piece of information in the long game to get the players questioning Lorenzo's motives. After resting the night, it's worth mentioning the food buff. Mercer had the Furbolg brew some tea that granted advantage on all their perception checks for the next 8 hours, which is a nice surprise to occasionally throw at the players. You keep it rare enough where the players feel like it's a reward or a cool bonus for making a friend rather than an attack roll, but not so common that they start looking everywhere for food buffs to hoard before big boss fights. Mercer leads them back to the road and at about 2.5 hours in asks what their pace is, and Liam says in passing, alright, let's run these bastards down, which is the first anyone has actually voiced that. Until now, there's no reason to think that they're going to charge headlong into combat at all. The day of travel ends, snow finally reaches them and Mercer lets the players pair up for their watches throughout the night, which technically, mechanically, with smaller groups this wouldn't leave them enough rest time to gain the effects of a long rest, but ignoring that rule and letting them pair up as we see here has this wonderful benefit for tables with a strong roleplay element, as it allows for one-on-one interactions and combinations that otherwise might never occur. And here it pays off with Sam and Ashley, then Mercer and Taliesin, and finally Liam, who soliloquizes while the others are asleep. They continue for the next day of travel, passing another cart travelling in the opposite direction, and finally spotting the Shepherds on the horizon. We're 2 hours 53 minutes in, so right at the end of an expected session. Perfect. Mercer can let them figure out their plans and end it there, setting up the next session accordingly. So he settles back to see what they'll do. Liam's ready to jump right into the thick of it, but Taliesin says, I think we should wait until they start to set up camp. Marisha's first move is to double check how far they are from their destination and how late in the day it is, which Mercer answers plainly. It's near the end of the day and you still have at least 2 days of travel before you. So as of now, from Mercer's perspective, this is great. They're thinking of spying the camp and they know they have days worth of trailing available to them. And taking Mercer's hint from earlier, Liam casts suggestion on Ashley demanding any information helpful in the coming conflict. Even better, Ashley will be able to clarify their options and what they're really up against. And as often as the rule of thumb for PvP spells and checks like this, Mercer has Ashley roll, but ultimately the extent of the effect and how she plays it is up to her. Mercer's not about to pull out a sheet and start reading off her secrets, it's still her story to tell. Ashley reiterates that there are 5 of them and gives her understanding of their race class combinations, which the players take to be fact. 5, 2 being casters, and only 1 of those could be a healer. This is beginning to seem very doable to them, and recognizing what's taking shape, Mercer starts adding, not correcting, but flourishing Ashley's answers to to raise some questions, or at the very least, cast a shadow of something beyond her understanding. When she says Lorenzo is a fighter, Mercer adds, well, you know, he walks with this nasty looking glaive with a long hook blade at the end, giving him reach. Regarding the magic users, Mercer clarifies, you're pretty sure you don't know a lot about magic stuff, but one seems to be more nature-based and the other seems to throw spells but is more cocksure and charismatic. He's trying to sow doubt over her intel, but because everyone at the table knows that classes are rarely literal categories in the world, they misinterpret this to be him giving colour and reason to what Ashley's saying. They think by him saying that one throws spells and is charismatic, that's code for, yeah, this is how you know she's a sorcerer. The cocksure comment flies too high and too fast. And right when Ashley drops the bombshell that she was one of the shepherds, we hit 3 hours in. Time to start thinking about tying things up and setting the direction for the next session. Liam sends his familiar in to scout, and this is Mercer's first chance to give them real, without a doubt, accurate eyewitness information, and prove that Ashley is ill-informed. He works his way through what Liam sees, slowly counting out each of the figures, adding up to 7, but no one seems to notice, so he mentions it again at the end as a blatant punchline. You see what looks to be 7 figures. Ashley reacts, we can't attack them like this, there's 7 of them. But Sam, not so easily dissuaded, fires back, why not? Taliesin begins to formulate a plan. They could sneak into their camp and release the prisoners to help in the fight, but Ashley tells them that the shepherds break their prisoners, so they wouldn't be any use. Now, this is only a slight misunderstanding. They do break their prisoners, but really they don't get broken until they reach their destination, and her character would reasonably know that. But unlike the previous mix-ups where Mercer held back and observed, this could immediately quash quite an interesting strategy. So Mercer speaks up right away this time to correct their understanding. The process happens when they get back, but they will be manacled and gagged in the cells. Great, that's cleared up. The plan has the DM waving a flag to say it's possible, and all the players come together, forming their plot to get into the cages and untie the prisoners at night, after the shepherd's camp and before they reach their destination, where they may have even higher numbers to deal with. Now, this all sounds like a plan Mercer can prepare for, but then Sam adds on, should we continue to follow them or attack right now in broad daylight? And Mercer's eyes dart around to see everyone's reaction to this. They were talking stealth, now it's an attack? Ashley checks once more to see how long do they have until they reach their destination, so Mercer, trying to reduce any sense of urgency, speaks plainly once more. 3 days at the shepherd's pace. So they have a lot of time, there's no pressure, they can surveil, figure out what to do, and Taliesin returns the talk to his plan. But then Sam interjects, wait, we know where they're going. Why don't we ride ahead of them? Marisha finishes the thought, set up an ambush, and suddenly everyone is on board. Mercer's poker face leaves the building. Somehow in the span of a few seconds, they've flipped the table and are going with a daylight assault. Really, if we want to take a step back, it's not because it's a better plan, it's because an ambush sounds fun. It's not really something the players have had the chance to do before, and this novelty factor is a real thing that'll pop in and strongly influence player decisions, and as we see here, it even takes Mercer off guard. So Mercer knows that there is no way that this is going to end well for them, but if he ends the game right now with the players set on this path, that'll confirm in the players' minds that it's doable, that he ended the session so that they could be refreshed for the big boss battle next week. And then when they lose in the first round of combat, it'll completely ruin the energy for the rest of the session. But if he can rush them into the confrontation now, scare them off with a demonstration of Lorenzo's power, that'll be a great launch pad for the next session of rethinking, replanning, and tailing the shepherds. So towards that end, he rushes the players forward, shortening his descriptions from here on out, and even giving himself a few opportunities for the shepherds to maybe get the jump on the players and hurry this to its inevitable conclusion, starting right away with stealth checks for the players to not be noticed on the road behind them, which they succeed with a 20 and 19. He moves the players on. Alright, you find a place, so you have an evening to... What do you want to do for your ambush? He wants them right into it, and the players start tossing out ideas, but 5 minutes later, you can see the fatigue hitting them. Mercer starts to yawn, Liam has forgotten how many carts they saw, and the plan is suddenly becoming some weird combination of everything, where they attack, but instead of attacking, they're going to try and break out the prisoners the way they would have if they snuck in, but they're not sneaking in, they're doing it in daylight when everything's in motion. Really, everyone's tired, and they're off their game, and the conversation keeps circling. The same ideas are forming and being forgotten within the span of a sentence. But Mercer doesn't end things yet, because just a little further and he can make the impression and end the game. And after 10 more minutes, Mercer interjects to say, "You've found an area." This is the first of 3 moves that he can make to accelerate the players to a conclusion and end the game. First, describing the ambush site, then pulling out a map, and finally just having the shepherds show up. Now, this description, compared to his usual style, may seem out of place, but he's trying to keep it bare bones with only what relates to the combat ambush plan. And unlike most scenes, he's actually trying to communicate the layout of one of the maps that he has waiting in the wings for a situation such as this, so it's more constrained. The planning continues, and amongst all of this, a lovely, quite informative bit of roleplay takes place. Ashley grabs her temples, stressed at the mere thought of confronting Lorenzo. They probably wouldn't kill me on sight. Lorenzo likes to make examples of people. So what would you do if I bought you time? And tragically, the impact and meaning of that gesture is lost. The players are too tired to really hear it and instead reflexively respond with "kill the horses, couple of fireballs." Again, the plan is circling, and you'll see Mercer stops paying attention to what they're scheming, instead getting his notes ready for combat and perking up to listen only when Ashley says something, for her information could potentially shift the player's intentions. 5 more minutes pass, and Marisha boils her plan down to its elements. Keg, distract, not extract, Liam, subtract, parties. And Liam's version is simpler still. He puts down an alarm spell, they attack. It's late, and it shows. For the players, the context and specifics to this fight are being forgotten. It's becoming just another ordinary hack and slash combat round with the gimmick of planning the ambush. Ashley asks Mercer if she knows where the shepherds would go and what they would do if they let them pass and just followed. And he quite happily gives all the details of this wonderful alternative. They would go to the hideout, their homestead, where they would drop off their payload and celebrate for an evening of revelry, and then come back the next day to begin the process of preparing the slaves for delivery, which involves breaking them. So he's reminding the players that currently none of the prisoners are broken, they're all fine, and in fact they'll be unguarded for a whole night as the shepherds go get drunk to celebrate when they reach their destination. But no one is able to register and compute any more information this late in the game, and immediately Liam continues talking about the ambush plan. So another 5 minutes pass and Mercer progresses to stage 2, bringing out the map to get things going and letting them terraform. After all, this is the fun advantage granted by having an ambush encounter. You can alter the map as you will and make the environment more to your advantage. So we let them have a play, but after another 10 minutes, even Mercer is getting a bit fidgety. Are you guys ready to pull the trigger on this? And with a little more prompting, he's finally able to usher them into their long rest, which is when we see his second swing at giving the shepherds the upper hand, asking if the party is camping with or without a fire. Alas, they choose without, so he describes their sleep, the calm before the storm, touching upon the progress of the snowfall, and immediately Liam's alarm spell is triggered. The Iron Shepherds are approaching. He lets the players react, but begins an internal countdown until their arrival. They have to say what they're doing quickly if there's anything additional they want to stick in, and less than 60 seconds pass before he asserts the first cart entering the map. Mercer very kindly breaks this process into stages as the wagon train gets closer and reveals more of itself, pausing after each reveal to see if the players do anything, then moving it forward a bit more and expanding his description, or it's still possible that they'll back out upon seeing the 7 figures on the map. But at 3 hours and 45 minutes in, the ambush is sprung. Okay, time for Mercer to make a powerful introduction for the Iron Shepherds. The quickest way to do that is by demonstrating power the players are not expecting and not at all prepared to go up against. The more subtle way is to slowly reveal that each piece of intel the players thought they had was actually misinformed. Mercer, better to be safe than sorry, is going ahead with both barrels. From the very first round of combat, every turn will have a reveal. So Liam starts the combat with slow, and all but 2 of the shepherds fail, putting the players in a great position and further boosting their sense of "we can totally do this." Initiative is called, and Mercer very calmly states, "This all happens. Combat has begun." It's nearly 4 hours in, but he's not worried. He's not expecting this to last long. First, Sam oils up Lorenzo, and Marisha gets a couple of hits in on the Druid. Then it's Ruz's turn, and right out of the gate, Mercer openly states, technically not a sorcerer. And other than the unsettling calmness of the shepherds in the face of their ambush, this is the first hint. He goes further, openly stating her spellcast, Hypnotic Pattern, a 3rd level spell. The players themselves only just unlocked spells that high, so she's not a sorcerer, but she still has high level casting. Reveal number 2. Taliesin gets some hits in, then it's Lorenzo's turn. Here Mercer, in character, takes time to talk down to Keg, dismissing her and not even bothering to acknowledge the other player characters. He gestures towards where a few of them stand and tells his allies to step aside, beginning to cast a spell that he holds for their move. Another reveal. Not only is Lorenzo not a fighter, he's brazenly declaring his intent to cast an area of effects spell. Now, the players acknowledge this, they comment upon it, but ultimately, in their minds, they've started combat, so obviously they're going to fight it out. What else are they supposed to do? And as Proto, Liam, the two thugs, and Juan take their turns, you can see how low the energy is getting at the table. Rising briefly out of shock when Ashley, in a great little piece of mid-combat roleplay, gives herself disadvantage and runs away, throwing javelins at her most hated of shepherds. Mercer then has Dwelma openly cast Dispel Magic, another 3rd level spell, and proceeds to move her out of Lorenzo's line of fire, triggering his attack. Now, at this point, the players know 2 of the sidekicks have been slinging 3rd level spells, so what is Lorenzo going to... Oh, kind of cold. A 5th level spell. That's as big of a sign as you're going to get. And you see it clicks with Liam. That would have one-shot him. And Marisha reacts quite strongly as well. Mercer continues in character as Lorenzo after the attack, turning to Keg. Am I going to have to make a lesson here? He's saying to the table, I've made my point. These guys are out of your league. Perhaps a parlay, but Sam's reaction is to sort of laugh it off, saying, oh no, he's winning. Because as strong of a message as Mercer has given, the way these players are used to combat going is that its existence means it's winnable. Once started, it shall only be ended once the other side runs away or dies, which is to say, because they don't really have practice ending combat any other way, it doesn't register that they can, let alone how. Back to the top of initiative for round 2, and Sam continues on as if nothing changed, spending his turn trying to pick open the cages. Marisha, following his lead, keeps laying into the druid, who does go down, perking their spirits and restoring a bit of confidence, but Mercer makes it clear straight away she's unconscious, not dead. Another more meta hint this time is the way Mercer normally runs combat, only important characters don't immediately die when hitting 0 health. So this is Mercer saying, you haven't killed anyone yet, you can still walk away from this. Or even hold her as hostage, make a peace talk to get out of this alive. Ruse's turn, and Mercer, not wanting the shepherds to be aggressive beyond his show of force, has her openly take note of her fallen friend and Marisha's defensive stance, then cast Hold Person at level 3. A double-pronged tell here. Her level 3 spell before wasn't a one-off trick, and she's trying to stop the combat rather than directly deal damage. It's at this point that Mercer talks directly to the audience, saying he's sorry for how late the session is, but he wants to see how it turns out. And we are well over time, 4 hours 20 minutes, but this message is also for the players. It's late, the combat took a turn and is now at a crossroads. How are you going to play it? Talison's turn is up next, and responding to Marisha's call, says, if you're in for Lorenzo, I'm going for Lorenzo. So Mercer throws an acrobatics check at Taliesin to possibly stop his movement, but he passes and starts laying into Lorenzo. Yet even with a natural 20 impact, Mercer has Lorenzo respond only with calm, assertive dialogue. Alright, I see what you're doing. 1 for 1. Lorenzo is flanked. One of his allies is down. He was just hit with a natural 20. And he's completely unfazed. But also Mercer's word choice here, 1 for 1, is to make it clear to the players that Lorenzo is not looking to continue the combat any further. It's only because he was attacked that he will respond in kind, and no further. And on Lorenzo's turn, he attacks Molly with 2 strikes. And this one tiny little forgotten rule mistake is the straw that breaks Molly's back. Taliesin had asked earlier in the session if he had 1 or 2 blood maledicts. He's playing a blood hunter, a custom class Mercer has created and has just recently pushed out an update for that changed the answer. Mercer thought it was 1 and had answered as such. Taliesin disagreed. So Mercer conceded he would need to check, but he was operating with the notion that Taliesin only had 1 and he'd already used it, which means Mercer didn't think he needed to take a blood hunter reaction into his consideration when making the attack. But at that moment, after having already declared the 2 attacks, Taliesin refloats the question, and quoting the new rules, asserts that he does have a second. Why this is important is that Mercer declared 2 attacks. attacks. So the worst that could have happened was Taliesin going unconscious with the first, and then the second cost some failed death saves. A point is made, the combat ends with the threat. But now, Taliesin could go unconscious from the Blood Maledict first, and with the 2 attacks already declared, that's 4 failed death saves between them. So if he fails the Blood Maledict roll, it's instant death. And as soon as he makes that roll, you see this math rolling through Mercer's mind. He's unconscious, that's advantage on melee attacks. If he hits, that's an auto crit, and crits are 2 death saves. Maybe he'll miss. Mercer rolls. It's done. The table is speechless. Mercer continues the round, Proto returning fire at Ashley. Liam's turn, which is actually his first turn since the Cone of Cold went off, and he doesn't really know how to handle this, so holds an attack if the sorcerer does anything. Mercer has the thugs keep shooting at Marisha, and Taliesin leaves the table, knowing a TPK on the cards when he sees one. And at this, Mercer has Lorenzo deliver another calm threat that's really a call for peace. Is it time for another, or have you learnt your lesson? But reflexively in character, Marisha is having none of it. So Lorenzo continues. Then another laugh it is. Mercer has Warren the Barbarian close into melee range on Liam, and seeing little reaction amongst his players, decides subtlety isn't going to cut it. He directly says to the table, "It's not looking good, guys. Keg, you've seen these situations before. What are you going to do?" As much as he tried to layer in the hints and then the threats and then place certainty before them, walking away from combat is not something they know how to do. Ashley, taking Mercer's words on board, tries to parley, offering herself up as sacrifice. Mercer calls for a persuasion check, not necessarily to determine if it works, but how quickly it works, how severe her punishment is. Lorenzo likes displays of power and making examples, so this is exactly what he wants to hear. But with an 11, you probably have to wait until his turn comes around for the payoff. Dwelma fails her first death save, and it's back to the top, to Sam. Sam and Marisha keep strategizing the combat, but Mercer doesn't want this idea to continue, and he starts interspersing their conversation with the way the wind is blowing. The players themselves are shell-shocked. They're no longer able to make reasonable decisions. A well-rested Sam probably would have moved to Dwelma's unconscious form and threatened to cut a throat if he doesn't let them go. Anything other than a direct attack in the face of this. But these aren't the tools these players are used to using. They're not even aware they're in the toolbox, and now is a bit late in the session to be learning new tricks. At Marisha's turn, Liam asserts they're running. Mercer even tries to instruct her. You see Keg rush into parley. What do you do? She lights Lorenzo on fire. So to further de-escalate and vilify himself, Mercer describes Lorenzo just standing there and taking it, shaking his head with a smile as if to say, "You're doing nothing." She attacks him twice with her staff, a miss and a hit, but Mercer doesn't even describe the impact, needing to make it as clear as possible that even direct attacks are not going to make a difference here. We're out of subtext, it's just text from this point on. The metagaming pigeon tells her to run, and as she leaves, Mercer declares that Lorenzo saw the chance to take an opportunity attack, but looks back at Keg, more interested in what she has to say. But before Lorenzo's turn can end, it's Ruza, the sorcerer Liam had his spell waiting for, and Marisha is a little jumpy for it to go off, so Liam states that his intent was for it to go off only if she did something aggressive. Normally Mercer sticks quite strongly to the wording of the initial holding of a spell, but he's happy to allow a retcon at this point, and he makes a show of having Ruza being non-threatening, casting Cure Wounds on Lorenzo. And now at Lorenzo's turn, Mercer can finally wind this up and leave an impression. So how do we do this? Well, before anything, he needs to explain Lorenzo's justification for letting them go so it doesn't feel like DM mercy. Looking at the scene, Mercer declares Dwelma to have bled out, so it's a fair exchange given an example is made of Keg, and the players spread word of what happens if you cross the Iron Shepherds. All the while he still burns, seemingly unbothered. And without giving anyone other than Ashley a chance to talk, Mercer describes the Shepherds clearing the road and leaving, ending the session on a threat. So what can we take away from all this? Let's start with the lighter stuff. When dealing with ability checks, don't feel like you have to always constrain yourself to the specific focus asked by the player. If they rolled well, maybe they noticed something nearby or had a sudden breakthrough at another way to tackle the problem. And even if they do roll low, give your answer in a way that is flavoured by the character, the personality asking the question. If the players meet an orc and then one player wants to have a more discerning glance, don't just give more detail, give the detail that that character would be looking to see, maybe even project a little. When your players make mistakes with facts that they'd reasonably know, mixing up names, directions, allegiances, while it can feel reflexive to jump in and correct the player, you don't want them to feel like they're taking a quiz and failing. Use your best judgment to hold off and see how it plays out. Maybe hinting at the truth or straight up telling them during a lull in the conversation. This way, on the rare occasion something important does need to be addressed right there and then, your players will perk up and take it on board without feeling like they did something wrong. Come up with a theme or large-scale event that can act as a touchstone for your improvised descriptions across a session or maybe more. We saw Mercer used a change in the weather, but it could be as simple as texture. Anything you can use to motivate your descriptions, give you somewhere to start, someone to come home to, so you don't feel lost when describing the third house they've burgled that night. You dive straight into how your theme applies to the area. Beware the novelty factor. We saw the players abandon a reasonably fleshed out plan as soon as the option of ambush was suggested. All tables tend to come up with a few strategies that handle all their problems early on and then stick with them because they work. They know it, they're good at it. What else are they going to do? And DMs pick up on this pattern and fall into a rhythm of designing encounters they've only envisioned the players solving with those same strategies. But what can happen is if an opportunity presents itself to do something new, the players will just run at it, even if it's a far worse idea, because this is a game. They want to have fun, and new experiences are exactly that. So be prepared that when you present the players with their first chance to set an ambush, break someone out of prison, perform an assassination, even if it's out of line with what you expect of their characters and play styles, the players will probably want to do it. Okay, let's talk about what led up to the death. Mechanically, we know what specifically caused it, but there are all these more universal factors that came together in a horrible way, and they exist at every table. First, we can clearly see the difficulty in foreshadowing the combat power of a villain here. Mercer gave the players a meta warning last session. He laid out both physical evidence and anecdotal stories of their skill. He had a player with insider knowledge who said they were a horribly powerful 5, then revealed they were 7. He had sidekicks throwing spells just as high level as the players, and had the big bad himself throw one far higher. Even with all this, it wasn't enough. It's a popular trend to physically introduce the players to the big bad quite early on, giving them some sort of interaction, which I think of as the Strahd effect. But in these instances, the players are usually afforded some layer of protection or separation from the full impact of what the villain can do in combat. Maybe it's an illusion, or they fly away, leaving much weaker creatures to fight the players because that's all they're worthy of fighting. Without that barrier, no matter how well you play it, as we saw here, if you have players that see every combat as winnable, this is what can happen. And it's not even so much that they see it as winnable, but players only know about and only use the tools that they know they can use. If you sit down to Monopoly and say, I cast Fireball, you'll get the same look that Ashley got from some of the viewers when she started role-playing her fear during combat. For plenty of players and DMs, D&D is 2 games. There's combat and non-combat. You're flicking a switch. We're in combat? Okay, what's the biggest number I can deal in damage this turn? No thoughts of character, intimidation, charisma, non-combat effects, making peace. So it's up to us as DMs to teach the players what their options are. Just as you teach a new player in a puzzle room that they can ask to look closer at everything around them, you have to teach players, new and veteran alike, of the mechanics and tools you're hoping for them to use in combat. Straight up tell them in combat, don't forget, that one's down but conscious, so you could grab her as a hostage and threaten the others. Describe the mindset of their attackers. You see the 2 approaching, keep looking back at their sergeant, almost begging to be called off before reaching you. Thirdly, we make poor decisions when we're tired. We've all experienced the late night combat that goes terribly, and the next session the players are discovering all these core abilities they should have, could have, would have used, but didn't. I'm not saying don't play combat late, it's fun, that's why we do it. Just be aware, and if it's looking like it'll be quite a tough fight, either call the session there or throw a small, more basic encounter at them that they can dispatch more quickly. A few followers of the Warlock are sent charging out to delay the would-be heroes. Fourth, Shellshock. When something truly stuns the table like Molly's death, that's it. The players can't keep making decisions in character. They themselves are at a loss. If you keep playing as we see here, Sam and Marisha just continued with the combat that they were already set upon, because that's what their autopilot is telling them to do. This isn't their character's reaction, This is the player's inability to continue. Now it's rare, but when it happens, you will know it, and you should stop the session immediately. The players have lost their ability to continue. I've had it happen, and like Mercer did here, I tried to play through and end it shortly thereafter. And I regretted that, because although it's great to have such a strong player reaction, I felt like I'd robbed the players of a chance to have their character's true reaction in that moment. And what a way to end this session that would have been. Molly's eyes never shut, and that's where we'll end it this week. Getting a bit meta now, it's important to take note of your players' dynamic, their roles, not tank, healer, support, the players themselves. Whose only idea is combat? Who makes strategic combat plans? Who just agrees to the plans? Who makes plans that take into consideration the politics and motivation behind the fight? Who is excitable and louder and more likely to get their ideas heard? Who manages the table? And without them, order is lost and the quieter ones stay silent. It's one thing to know your normal complete table and be able to balance them out, but when one player, two players are missing, you need to stay alert to the fact that the dynamic has just changed, and like a first session all over again, you might need to put more effort into rebalancing the voices at the table. And maybe if your strategists are away, don't throw an ocean-style infiltration at them. Finally, Mercer knows his players very well, and he knows the sort of game that they want to play, and that involves an honest threat of death. But he's gentler than most because he knows these players want that full 1 to 20 saga to sing about their characters. He didn't intend to kill Molly, quite the opposite. When he declared the attack, in his mind, it was impossible to. So this last point is, if you too run a game where you don't want to go handing out new character sheets all the way up to 8th level, be very, very careful about player reactions, life tap effects, self-damaging effects. Don't fall into the trap of thinking that because you know what all the bad guys are going to do, that you know all the bad things that are going to happen. The players will always surprise you. And themselves. And that's Found and Lost. I tried to condense it, I swear I cut so much out. My voice left an hour ago. Thank you to my patrons. If you liked this video, share it around, subscribe for more. You know what I'm gonna ask. What was your first player death and did you mean to do it? That's all for now. If you're not a patron yet, check it out. There's some public stuff. Patrons get these videos a week early and some bonus things. I'm gonna go rest my voice. Until next time, I'll see you down under in the comments.